I'm with Imogen Hermes Gowar, and we are going to be talking about The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock, which is your new novel just released.
Yes, it is.
Imogen has very kindly agreed to do a little walk around London with me, talking about the novel, but also talking about 18th century London, and in particular women in business.
So The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock is set in 1780s London. In Deptford, a middle-aged merchant, Mr. Hancock, is waiting for his ship to return. It doesn't come back, but what he gets instead is this kind of tiny, mummified, mermaid-type creature, about this kind of baby-sized, that is, nowadays we know that it would be made probably from a monkey stitched onto a fish's tail. But meanwhile, across the city in Soho, Angelica Neal, a high-class, highly desirable courtesan, has recently been bereaved of her keeper and is looking for someone else to pay her bills. Mr. Hancock and Angelica are drawn together into the orbit of this mermaid, and they set out to climb the Georgian social ladder.
So I got sent this wonderful novel as a proof back in August and completely fell in love. It's a rich historical novel with amazing characters that just leap off the page. The 18th century is, as you probably already know, an interest of research for me, because that's what I did my MA on. It's genuinely probably one of the best historical novels I've read, because it fills these wonderful details of the 18th century without kind of like bogging it down. It's just like sprinkles these gems of research. Imogen, my lovely now camerawoman, has written a wonderful novel. What me and Imogen are going to do, we're going to move through London and give you little bits of 18th century. So currently we are in Seven Dials, and now I'm going to film Imogen to tell you a bit more about the 18th century history.
So we're starting in Seven Dials, which appropriately enough was built in the 1690s by a man called Thomas Neal, which is actually where I stole the name for my heroine Angelica Neal, was having seen it written here in Seven Dials when I started thinking about sex workers during the 18th century. This area was initially built to appeal to the affluent upper classes who were expanding into this area of London at the end of the 17th century, but throughout the 18th century it became increasingly down at heel. And what sprang up in this area was quite a large second-hand clothes market, so lots of pawned or stolen or cast-off dresses and pretty things were very easily available here at knockdown prices, which was useful for the sex workers who plied their trade in this area, that they could kind of borrow glamour very easily. There was a real tradition in 18th century thought that women might be tempted into sin with the lure of beautiful things, that, you know, that there are these stories about women committing murder for the sake of a lovely ribbon, or, you know, being drawn into immoral behaviour like sex because they wanted pretty things. So we have moved now into Covent Garden, which during the 18th century was kind of synonymous with actors, opera singers and inevitably sex workers. It was generally felt that actresses must be disreputable and were probably involved in having sex outside of marriage throughout the 18th century. There are several reasons for it, and a lot of it is to do with the fact that any woman in a public facing role where she kind of becomes public property is therefore like can't belong to one person, that she's seen and enjoyed by crowds of people, therefore she's pleasing people other than her husband. And I think with the rise of print culture as well, partly it's possible to like pass gossip around about these women, but also like they can be seen by anyone, like their portraits can be owned by anyone. They're all these pieces of themselves like spread around the city, and people, I suppose like contemporary celebrity culture, people feel that they know them and have all these ideas about them already.
I think you do. You have that in the novel as well, with Angelica and Jonah actually seeing the picture of Angelica. So Angelica, obviously the heroine of the novel, is out there because she is, you know, this courtesan, but she is in the print culture of the time. And it's her images that's in the print culture, which I thought was a really interesting thing.
I think for her that would be really important. Like for her that's a positive thing, because her reputation rests on being seen and being desirable and having that kind of attached social cachet. So someone like Emma Hamilton kind of got her love. She's great. I don't know if I would have liked her, but I really respect her a lot. So someone like Emma Hamilton really amped up her public profile by having strong relationships with artists, particularly George Romney. So her portrait could be displayed in the Royal Academy. People from a much higher social class would see it, and she would become like socially desirable as a mistress because her image was seen and desired and passed around. So someone like Angelica Neal would really want to be part of this print culture and to have her image passed around as much as possible, because that's her reputation and her livelihood.
Another thing that Covent Garden was really known for in print culture was Harris's list of Covent Garden ladies. So Harris's list was basically like a timeout of the Covent Garden sex workers. It was a list of kind of what experience you could have and what type of lady you could have. It's a really interesting piece of material to kind of look at.
Yeah, if she's got someone who pays for her already and you have to like come at certain times when he's not there.
Yeah, so
or
the
like
practicalities.
Yeah, exactly. Or and if she like rents the house herself and she has rooms in it that she rents out to other prostitutes and like there's a whole like social world there, especially like the stories of how these women got there. So quite often in Harris's list there'll be some kind of background as to how she ended up in a top room in Soho selling her body for money. And I think as the editions go on, these get kind of more and more just titillating, like they're longer, they're more fantastical, and they're really definitely written to kind of get men going. And I think at that point almost these books are almost written for like people, it seems like they're written for men to read at home for their own pleasure rather than being an actual practical guide to who are you going to sleep with tonight. But there are some like really interesting little, I think when I started reading it, that was when I was just kind of first interested in 18th century women and sex work, and it felt like a really interesting glimpse into their world. It's very much like from a man's perspective, and it's very much kind of almost justifying their behaviour. So like a lot of it will be like, you know, that it's not the girl's fault, or that she's a nice girl, she can speak French, she can play the piano, she never swears, like, and it makes them feel better. It makes them feel like this is just some poor virtuous girl and some bad stuff's happened to her and it's not their fault, like they're not contributing to this problem. She's just fallen now, it's done.
You're completely right actually when you said about how it was, you know, a way almost to men kind of begin like basically erotica really, like the way the descriptions, and so it is very voyeuristic. And so actually when you said about that, the idea that it is for men to read and that they're getting a certain amount of pleasure, and also the question of kind of the morality of the women and kind of bringing that on a platform is is obviously problematic, but it is very male, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And I think like there is a kind of male narrative in that period which changed in the Victorian times, that became very much a woman's moral failing why she's gone into sex work, whereas in the 18th century the narrative was a lot more that she's fallen into the hands of the wrong person. So it's the boards and the pimps who are the bad people running the show, and the girls are all just hapless victims in it. It's not their fault, which kind of, I think it lets men off the hook, that they think that they're not the baddies in this situation. And then as a result of that, the way that especially boards are thought about during this period, like that incredibly hostile feelings towards women who run brothels. I guess partly that aspect of their running a business, and which is an unnatural public position for women to take, but also the fact that they are sending these girls to their, you know, moral demise. That terminology for them, like calling them mother, like Mother Needham and people like that, is it's almost a joke, the same way as calling her an abbess is. It's a joke about the unnaturalness of their behaviour. Georgian society is incredibly ageist, especially in women, like old fat women who are who are like past their fertile years and they're not married. Like what are they for? Like they're useless. I think the idea of them being in a position of influence and power is like what's particularly distasteful in the 18th century. Is like those women are done. Like what's the
they
use?
become like grotesque caricatures of what a woman should be and what a woman should look like. So I guess that idea again of them being mothers, because a mother is someone obviously who has been fertile and has had these, so even the fact that something that was so prized as in maternity, you then have this grotesque woman
it's like
is
skewed.
selling almost with children. Like it's that kind of, that maternity is becoming this really disgusting thing in 18th century thought.
Like according to Rousseau, like parents are the child's first teachers, and they've got a responsibility to nurture their children in the right way. So for someone to distort motherhood, which is being increasingly put on a little pedestal during that period, is like particularly distasteful.
Yeah, because there's also a movement in like this is my own kind of like research thing about like breastfeeding. It suddenly kind of came back to be a thing to do. So women who therefore didn't breastfeed and sending their children away or giving them to wet nurses were then unnatural because they were breaking that bond. So I guess in a way for these kind of mothers, by giving these daughters to men, it's another element of separation from natural maternity. So it's a weird breaking of kind of that bond, as you said.
One particular woman whose letters that I read, who like, she was so like agonised about the fact that she hadn't breastfed her children, like that her 5-year-old, she's like looking at him thinking that she's let him down, like that she's like screwed up the first years of his life because she didn't breastfeed him herself. Like,
that's like, and I mean you can see that like totally even now, but even like in Wollstonecraft, I think it's in Mary, I think, in one of her short stories, there is so much kind of separation. It's basically the separation of this character in Wollstonecraft's kind of novella. It's basically just because she's been separated from her natural mother, and that has caused her moral decline. So even that beginning of separation from that bond literally is like, well, if you haven't had a mother and she hasn't been close to you, then you're going to end up as someone that has no moral compass. So it's a really kind of interesting obsession.
Especially when you consider that I don't know how true it was, but there was a narrative which boards perpetuated that girls had been sold into their service by their parents. That like either these parents acted like good parents and they were like, actually, do you know what? This is the best we can offer our child. Like she's going to have sex for money, but she will be educated and clean and have medical attention, and maybe she'll go up in the world. Or were they incredibly unnatural parents who are like, how much cash can we make from getting our daughter drunk and raped? Like there's a whole weird world. When I started writing the book, one of the things that I did was write a Harris's List entry for Angelica Neal, but then kind of as I wrote it, I realised that she was from a different world from someone in Harris's List. As much as the women in that might be charging a couple of guineas maybe if they were lucky, and they would have quite high class visitors, they just weren't quite the sort of person that Angelica was. That I was more and more interested in these very high-class courtesans who were working in St James's at the time and what their fortunes ended up being. But Harris's List kind of just brought this, I think, a texture to my and a better understanding of how women might come into sex work, and how someone like Angelica, who is not a Londoner, would have come to London as a teenager with certain expectations, and often those expectations for many real young girls were dashed when they couldn't get the work that they had been promised. That actually, because they had no training, there was no real possibility of their doing an apprenticeship or learning skills. They couldn't fall back on a profession as men did. They couldn't rely on having a particular way of making ends meet. Their options are, if they're lucky, taking up a position in a house as a maid, maybe taking in laundry, embroidery, selling flowers, really kind of small money jobs. And to fill in the gaps, there would always be sex work. That's the one thing that they would all have as a tool at their disposal, is just their body for someone else's money. I think here in Covent Garden, with St Paul's Church just on the left here, is roughly the site of Mole and Tom King's coffee house. It was a popular spot to pick up women. So Moll and Tom King were husband and wife who set up this coffee house together, and it was frequented by sex workers, kind of celebrated as an easy, fun place to go and pick up a woman. Many of the girls who circulated here were memorialised in contemporary gossip, print culture, and also in images. Hogarth himself engraved a picture of a night inside Moll and Tom King's coffee house. When Tom died, Moll carried on by herself, so she was running a business, which was quite often women who had their own businesses often had it as a result of being bereaved, that either they had worked for their father in the family business and then all the men in their family had died and they had stepped up, or their husband had died and left them with his business, which they would run sometimes for the benefit of their children until they became adults, and sometimes to continue making a living in, because they'd already built up a respect from their peers, which a woman attempting to start her own business wouldn't necessarily have.
So coffee houses in the 18th century is one of my personal kind of academic interests, and one thing I found really fascinating of that time period is women's place in business, in particularly these coffee houses, because obviously with Moll King, coffee houses were a place of sociability. They're a place where men came to discuss business and news. So even in the periodicals of the time, the periodicals are kind of set in coffee houses. Each coffee house would have maybe a particular type of person who frequent them. So if you're interested in literature, you'd go to a particular one. Politics, the same. So the 18th century is the age of sociability. It is the place of discussion and of print culture and news. But what's so interesting is that women aren't allowed in them. Women can be a proprietor of a coffee house, like Moll King. They can be in business, but you wouldn't really be comfortable as a woman to walk in, and you really wouldn't have been made welcome either. Women who were in coffee houses were then either seen as just intruders, and if they were working there or owning the place, it became synonymous with sex work. Women's business was always seen as their body.
She's obliging someone in exchange for money, whether or not that involves using her body in any way. She's still, in this public space, it's not for her, and she's accepting money for it. We are now on Mermaid Street, which is just off Dean Street. This street was built as a result of, there was a huge amount of speculation going on during the 18th century where these new pieces of land, which had previously been on the outskirts of the city, started being kind of gently colonised by the gentry and the well-heeled. So a street like this, Mermaid Street, is built by Mr. Mermaid in the hope that he's able to fill up these lovely, grand, early 18th century houses with the right kind of tenants. And one of the things that he has designed is that these houses also double as workspaces. So upstairs is where the family would live, and then they can enter it through this separate door. But they've also got the shop underneath, which they can get through to with an internal door, but which is entered separately. So your business is really, really tied up with your home, and it happens in the same space. But there is also a kind of division within that between kind of public business space and the private space upstairs in these rooms with their big windows and panelled drawing rooms, which were designed to appeal to this kind of burgeoning, wealthy middle class. What happened in Soho within the space of a few generations is that the wealthy, respectable people moved on. So by the 1780s, when Angelica Neal is living here on Dean Street, just round the corner, it's no longer quite such a desirable area, that a lot of sex workers have moved in. Sometimes their keepers will rent a whole house for them and they'll let the rest of the rooms out to other women. And many of the women in Harris's list are based in this sort of area. Like, it's not it doesn't have that seedy reputation that Covent Garden does, but it's also not fancy like St James's. It's a sort of place that is affordable, and a woman could maybe rent a few rooms, but it's not upper class. So a lot of the buildings on Dean Street that were built at the same period as this have been demolished for one reason or another, and I did purposefully choose a house for Angelica that no longer exists. But this is the exact sort of house that she would have lived in, which would have had quite often a business on the ground floor, and underneath Angelica there is a mantua makers, which does also double as the women who work there do tend to prostitute themselves as well, which was quite often the case, was to present your business as if it were legitimate and then have sex going on in the back room. On the first floor, where these big windows are, which would have been the parlour of a wealthy family, would be where the kept women lived, in these high class courtesans. So Angelica, she's at the beginning of the book, is slightly down on her luck. She would hope to have a whole house, but in the meantime a floor of one of these houses does very well for entertaining guests. You've got a big airy front space, you're removed from the street enough so that not everybody can walk in, but you're still kind of reachable in this area and you're findable. Above her there might well have been other women trading in the apartments above. The architecture of these buildings was designed to represent a hierarchy of use. So the ground floor was meant to be for business, the top floor with its small windows were meant to be for servants and nurseries and that kind of thing, and these middle floors are the genteel living space, and that was generally reflected by the sex workers who then chose to use them. So you've got these grand middle spaces, the top floors with the small windows and lots of stairs to climb before you get to them. Those are for the less exclusive women, so there might be more of them in a smaller space, and they're definitely charging less, and it's less of a it's a less glamorous experience for visitors. It's much more basic. As I say quite often, if a woman was lucky, she could rent the whole house and then like fill it up with her friends and people who needed space to live in and trade in. The women who are working in houses like this for themselves, outside of any kind of family system or hierarchy or business, are essentially rogue agents, which is kind of what is so threatening about them. And that really interested me, that women outside of family systems were seen as almost kind of siphoning off money that should rightly have gone into the home. But on the flip side of that, it felt really important to me to think about women who were part of a family network and what their role was inside that. So Suki, Jonah Hancock's 14-year-old niece, felt like a really important character for me in bearing that out, that she's been purposefully removed from school to live in his house and work as his housekeeper. And this was kind of the role of girls in middle class families, that they were an extra pair of hands. They were financial agents in a lot of ways, that the man that she married would be marrying her partly for her dowry and the business opportunities that would give him. So there was this kind of important father-in-law, son-in-law relationship where money is being passed down via the girl. It also meant that the women of the family had these kind of networks between them. She thinks that her husband's business decision is a bad one. She can pass that on to her father, who could stop funding it. If she feels like she's being badly treated, she might have an ability to affect what funds are put where. Someone like Suki is kind of part of a network of very limited female power. So she's in this house where she has no choice to be. She's now a housekeeper, but she's important. It's important to her mother that she is there, because this is one way that she can feed back information about how Jonah is spending his money. The daughters of these families were often expected to be quite proficient in bookkeeping. It was a valuable asset for them to understand business, so that when it came for their turn to marry, they were not kept princesses. They were involved and they understood what financial loss might mean, and they knew how to run a household responsibly. That being that kind of a helpmeet to your husband was really important in these mercantile middle classes. And this is the education that Suki is getting. It's how to economically run a house, how to look over account books but maybe not make active decisions about them. Angelica and Suki to me felt like two sides of the same coin of middle class women's experience, that Angelica does not have a family and is finding a way to fend for herself as best she can, whereas Suki is contained within a tight family network, which gives her a lot of safety and security, but very few choices about where she can go and how much agency she has over anywhere, any situation.
We're going to wrap up for today, just because the light is getting slowly slowly fading, and it's getting a bit colder. older, but I have to say a massive thank you to you, not only for writing a novel that I know I'm going to really, really treasure, but also for agreeing to do this day with me. So thank you so much for taking this time and for showing us all a little bit of Georgian London and just kind of letting us be in the world of Angelica Neal and Jonah Hancock for this short, brief time. What you can now do is go and read the book. It is out now in hardback, and you can explore more of Georgian London and just fall in love with this novel and the characters in the same way that I did.
Thank you for having me so much. It was so much fun.
Good.
Thank you.